All right, this episode we're talking with Shane Parker. Shane has ran over 300 trail cameras in Alabama. He shares what he's learned from running that amount of cameras. He's talking about thermals, how deer use them, how you can use them to your advantage, and some really great insight to sharpen your blade for this upcoming season. I hope you guys enjoy it. Let's get right into it. Here we go.
Ready to get this, get a couple days of rest and hit it hard with this cold front that's coming in this weekend.
Yeah, it's the cold front we've all been waiting for. And so we were talking, you walked 27 miles in 6 days. What the heck were you looking for? What were you doing?
Man, just looking for sign. Basically, right now, I found a lot of it. Just kept finding more and more, so I just kept going and going and going. Basically, I'm trying to learn a whole new area, and I don't have much experience in this area, so I'm just trying to learn as much as I can, as quickly as I can. I've dropped about 30 something cameras over the last really 2 weeks in there. And so I've just been checking them periodically and did a lot of that this weekend and just trying to figure out exactly where I need to be and what I need to be doing.
Yeah, what kind of sign were you specifically looking for? Mass trees or scrapes or everything, all the above, or what made you most excited?
Yeah, I mean, I really wasn't expecting to find the amount of sign that I did this weekend. I was mainly just looking for feed, trails, things like that, just tracks, trying to cut tracks through these different like travel phones and stuff like that. But found just an enormous amount of sign, scrapes, rubs, things I really wasn't expecting to find in this area right now. It just lit up the last 3 or 4 days really, and it was just incredible. So I just kept just basically pegging spots, pinning them, putting cameras, and did that this whole weekend. I basically gave up hunting. We opened here in Alabama in a couple different zones this past Saturday, and I only spent one afternoon in the tree, and I only spent like 2 or 3 hours in the tree. Then the rest of the time I've just spent scouting. Because it's just hit or miss. When it's really really warm like this, it's like you got just a short window to really get after it, and I'd rather just spend that time scouting and bumped a bunch of deer. So it's been good.
That's exciting. And so the 30 cameras you deployed, I'm just curious, what provoked a camera placement? Was it mainly scrapes where you put those on?
I was actually putting it on, and this is what I try to do if I come into an area that I'm not really familiar with, because you come into it and you don't have a lot of sign. So I'm looking at sign that I think happened last year, like in these travel funnels, like old rubs, old scrapes, things like that. And I'm just trying to take a chance that buck survived. And what they'll usually do is, if you find a historical scrape that looks like it's been there a few years, more than likely it's going to light back up at a certain period of time near that rut. And so that's what I was trying to find, is just finding these places that are historical and working off of them. And then once I get that information that I've got a buck in there, then I'll kind of back away from that with my cameras and try to find those consistent terrain and habitat edges, gaps, saddles, things like that I can work off of to try to figure out a route of movement. Just try to backtrack from that point. But what I was doing right now is just trying to find that old sign from last year, drop some cameras in there, and just wait, because that's really when you're entering a whole new area. I figured out it's you can really fall in love with fresh sign that pops up. But if you're using your cameras to hunt off of year to year, like I'm dropping a camera now and I'm gonna try to hunt off that camera the information it gives you. A lot of times, especially unless you have cell cameras, you're chasing that buck around. You're never ahead of him. It's just really hard. So it's really just trying to find that historical stuff and then backtrack off of it right now.
Yeah, I think that's the one hindrance with cameras, is it usually leaves you chasing them rather than predicting. And
Yeah.
I know I've been guilty of that in the past. So when you're putting out these 30 cameras, and so you're still, sounds like, just trying to find the fresh sign and hunt that. And so basically you're hunting the actual terrain features versus what the cameras are telling you, and you're just trying to figure out what bucks are in there. Is that a correct
Yeah,
assessment of that?
exactly. Yeah, yeah. I'm just trying to locate a buck and then try to find that terrain that he's using.
Hmm.
I'm not going to use if I see a buck on camera during daylight, sure, that's really really good. But even if I don't, if I catch him during the night, as long as I know he's in there, then I think I can at least get a pretty good peg of what he's probably using just based off of history, basically.
Hmm. Yeah, and so before we get too far into this, Shane, first off, thanks for coming on here, and I just want to learn a little bit more about you. I kind of binged some of your videos here on YouTube, and I'm excited about to talk about thermals and everything else, and some specific things in October too. But why don't you just introduce yourself for people that maybe aren't familiar with you?
Well, my name is Shane Parker. I'm from North Alabama. Um, I'm kind of I guess, a trail camera junkie in a way. I guess you could call me that. I've kind of got into that over the last few years. Basically, my story is as far as hunting is I grew up hunting with a bunch of older guys that kind of took me under their wing when I was younger. Taught me a lot about hunting, a lot about deer, a lot about deer travel. So a lot of stuff that I use now is stuff that they've taught me. And so when I hunted for, basically 15, 20 years, just living off of that. We started, the area I grew up hunting in was they allowed dog deer hunting. So a lot of the things that I use is based off of what I learned um, with those deer, how they acted under pressure,
Mm.
especially without those dogs, because it's a lot of escape routes, things like that. Once pressure is applied to them, I learned that. And I just apply that to kind of my trail camera and the hunting I do now. So yeah, that's basically what I'm doing right now is just trying to predict what's going to happen when pressure is applied to those bucks, just based off of my history of hunting. So uh,
And, and so now I'm not familiar with Alabama, but on some of those units, for instance, where you just walked a lot of ground, do they allow dog hunting on that still today, or are you just guessing what hunting pressure is going to do what similar to what the dog pressure would do?
yeah, they don't pretty much dog hunting is very very right now very limited in Alabama. It died out probably um, 15, 20 years ago. They started kind of doing away with it in certain public areas. So right now I'm just utilizing the pressure that the hunting pressure basically, and how
Hmm.
that'll kind of move them around.
Hmm.
That's the approach I'm taking right now, because I feel like that's the approach that probably will give me the best chance of success right now, since I don't have like couple of years of these trail camera data right now. I'm just trying to predict what these bucks will do when there's a little bit of pressure applied to them.
And so, if you want to share it, that's fine. I'm just a little curious. So, what provoked going to a completely kind of sounds like kind of starting over here a little bit? Was the other spot just kind of overran, or just weren't seeing the bucks that you wanted and wanted to try something different?
No, I mean, really, it was more of a family thing. We moved back several years ago and built a home on my the land that I grew up on, in the area that I grew up in. And our family just kind of through different circumstances kind of got to a point where we needed to basically uh, reassess what we're doing for the next 15, 16 years. So me and my wife just decided that we would look for a different place that's near her family. We kind of moved there, and she said basically it was like, well, I want to move back closer to my family at least a little bit, not get totally all in the, because they live kind of in that city. I said, well, it's got to be somewhere that I got a lot of public land to roam. I said,
Right.
I've got to have that. Like that's my go-to. And so we just kind of picked this spot,
That's
and
cool.
it's like I said, completely foreign to what I'm used to. And we're bought a home on a lake that's nearby, so we're looking forward to that. But that's really just the gist of it. We just did a reassessment of where we were in life, and this was where we chose to move. So
Yeah. Well, that's that's a good reason for spreading your wings here and figure something else out.
yeah.
And so I guess one question on that is with a lot of people like to do the postseason scouting. Obviously, that's arguably the best time to be able to read a lot of that sign and understand and predict for this fall. But it sounds like were you doing a lot of summer scouting, or has this transition happened here in the last couple of weeks to where you're pounding the pavement right now? Because I guess the essence of the question is the debate of summer scouting when it's kind of hard to read sign versus right now where it's maybe you're getting some fresh stuff and you can kind of make a little bit more assumptions after you find some fresh sign to correlate to the old sign.
Yeah, yeah. No, I didn't get to put much summer scouting into here, and to be honest with you, unless for me, summer scouting, if I'm going into a new area, is really hit or miss because it can really be like you either hit on something and you find a bachelor group, but there's no guarantee that they're going to be there in the fall. So I don't put a lot of value in that other than just identifying like the bucks that are in the area. But like I said, there's no guarantee that they'll be in there. So I didn't get to do a lot of summer scouting in this area at all. We came in the 1st of August and just did a little bit getting familiar with the area. Dropped a few cameras in areas, and the cameras that we dropped actually got taken over by hippies. So that's a whole
what?
other story. So
What?
ended up pulling all them out, and so it was just useless. So now I'm just trying to find and hoping that sign that I'm finding is actually from last year, which I'm pretty confident it is. So
Yeah. And so, were they tinkering with your cameras? Were they anti? Were they not happy with what
no,
you're doing in there?
no, this place has some really interesting terrain. It has a lot of I don't know if you call them caves, but they're like big drainages that have rocks overhanging, and so
Uh-huh.
they're really cool places for people to hang out. So these people drug an old porta potty by my camera, like tents, you name it, and they
Yeah.
just basically built up residence right in the area that I kind of picked out to kind of hang my hat in an area, and they just kind of overran it. So I pulled everything out of that and went to a whole different area. So yeah, it's crazy.
That is pretty crazy. That's funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool. So, something that you talk a lot about on your YouTube channel, and I just want to dive into thermals and the most basic high level portion, just because I think most people understand what they are and the general theory of it. But just give me the most basic explanation of thermal when it comes to deer hunting and why hunters should pay attention to them.
Well, a thermal is basically a wind flow direction that is generated either by the cooling of the ground or the heating of the ground. So um, that's basic. That's the basic premise of the thermal. Um, the basic premise of hunting it is you have in the morning you're going to have dropping thermals to a certain point. During the day, those thermals are going to switch as the ground heats up, and in the afternoon you have a reversal. So once the ground cools down and the sun starts setting, those thermals are going to kick in and reverse. So it's basically lower elevation usually, or elevations that don't get sunlight that much are going to continue dropping thermals, or could continue dropping thermals, and you're trying to base um, your hunting off of that movement that those switches and thermals are gonna basically kick off. So,
Mhm.
and that's what I do a lot of. So it's a lot of hunting off of drainages, ditches, water sources, creeks, branches, springs, um, shaded out areas that don't get a lot of sunlight, and that's a lot of what I do is just try to go into areas and scout more for the wind, for those thermals, dropping a lot of milkweed in those areas, figuring out what those thermals are doing at different points and different times of the day, and then build a profile of how that could basically benefit me if I'm going in there to hunt.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's something that has gotten a lot more popularity, and for good reason, because I think it's a great way to get an advantage. But I also think, and this is my perception, is I feel like there's probably some myths or some thermal theories that aren't what maybe people get wrong. So I guess in your
Yeah.
opinion, what are some of the biggest shortcomings or common myths that people don't understand when it comes to thermals in relation to hunting whitetails?
Well, usually the biggest common myth has to do with those rising thermals. A lot of people assume that once the sun hits the forest floor, um, that you're going to get a switch in thermals. Or a lot of people believe that. That once that sun hits, that thermals changed, and now you're setting your you don't have to worry about that drop in thermal anymore. That thermal's rising above the canopy and things like that, and you can hunt off of that. And that's usually not the case. Usually people think it's at a certain point in time of the day, like 8 o'clock, thermals are going to switch because the sun's up, ground's warmed, and there's a lot of factors that play into that. So I think it's just, that's the biggest myth. The other, I guess, biggest myth is that I don't know how to quite explain a couple things that I've heard about people. Like I said, they think that their thermals rise into infinity.
Sure.
But like once my scent is up with the thermals, it's going completely away from me. And that's probably, I don't know if it's just maybe what they've experienced throwing milkweed. As far as you can see it, it's rising, but at some point in time, it doesn't really matter unless you've got a strong enough wind current above the canopy that takes it, far away and dilutes your scent. It's probably going to fall out somewhere around you at a different point. So I think that's what gets people busted a lot of times, trying to hunt off of those rising thermals.
And yeah, and do you think in order to understand that better, is that just time in the stand and dropping a lot of milkweed to slowly figure that out? Because I mean,
Yeah,
I have to imagine there's so many conditions that make a difference.
yeah,
You mentioned how much rain or how much wind is above the canopy. What is the wind speed? Is there
yeah,
leaves on the trees? Is there not leaves on the tree? I
yeah,
mean,
yeah. It's really like, if you think about it, it's almost like there's so many different variables. It'll make your head spin.
yeah,
And a lot of times that's why I don't really. The only time that I really concern myself with a rising thermal, and I'm of the theory that I believe that a lot of our midday movement on those really cold bluebird day mornings, where it's
mhm,
really, you got a heavy frost, and this is just my theory based off of all the stuff I've seen on trail cameras. On those really cold bluebird mornings, when you have a heavy frost, or on mornings where you have a lot of midday movement, I think that a lot of that is kicked off by that rising thermal. It seems to be that elevation, higher up, say in the upper 1/3, gets a lot of movement um, in that time period, that 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. time period, when that ground is being warmed up, and that's where a lot of scrapes, a lot of your sign stuff like that is laid down. And that's really the only time that I'm trying to hunt a rising thermal, is in those areas. And I'm doing it on a micro level. Like, I'm not doing it to where I'm thinking that the entire, area that I'm hunting has a rising thermal, because that's just not the case. That's when those deer bounce around to these different drainages and different elevation points and gets them up and moving, because each one of them have a different wind profile and a different scent profile in them. So
right.
that they're just basically trying to gain as much information as they can, as quickly and as efficiently as they can. They're no different than us working a job.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. So, when you mentioned hunting let's just run through an example so people understand. So, when you're hunting that upper third on a bluebird day with the hard frost, and they start to rise there, let's say 10 o'clock in the morning, walk through an example of the wind direction and how you're set up in coordination to whatever terrain feature you're set up on. So, if you're on a south facing slope, and is it a north wind that you're set up on that, or a south wind?
I mean, I guess it just depends on how the sign is laid down in there. But in particular, I had one where I killed a buck on, like 3 years ago, and he wasn't using. I never got him on this upper 1/3 during the day. Rarely ever. Like, he had a couple scrapes. His bedding area was up there, but he just didn't work that area very often. The only time he ever did was on those really, really cold, and it was usually nighttime images that I was getting him working this straight line, and it led directly into his bedroom, into one of his bedding areas. And so we had a real cold morning. It was a couple days after Thanksgiving. It was like 29, 28, 29 degrees, um, heavy frost. This was a northeast facing ridge that had a couple drainages that that dumped out to the north and west, and he was working from the west. So he was coming in from coming up the west side drainage,
Mm-hmm.
the one that was facing the west. He worked up through a little saddle, and then he worked that ridge right down to where I was working that straight line. It was kind of above that saddle along a little. It was like an edge of this pine thicket where it broke out into some open hardwoods. So he didn't like he basically, I had him on camera in that west facing thermal hub till I want to say it was 8:30, 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning. He stayed in that thermal hub. Like he passed one camera at like 7:15, and the next camera up is 8:30. So it took him all. He stayed in that thermal hub
Wow.
for almost an hour. Just
Yeah.
kinda, if he just staged out, made rubs. I went back. He kind of freshens up some rubs and scrapes. So it wasn't until that sun broke out on that hillside and had been basically warming that hillside up. Um, he didn't go into that area until then. It was like 8:30, 8:45, and so this thing had sunlight for 3 hours by that time.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was just slowly working his way up through there, and he was above, like the scrape line was on my level, which was on a little bench, and he was working the top of it. And so my area had sunlight for about 3 hours, but that top had sunlight for at least 45 minutes longer, and that's where he was working when I caught him.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of the setup I'm talking about is those areas where you can get those scrapes that are facing back east, like if they're facing east and you have a higher ridge above them, or if they're facing south, like if you had a ridge that's facing south, those are the ones you want to look. I think for that, because that's going to be the areas that get sunlight first. They're going to warm quicker, and those ridge tops that are above those, if you have a straight line that's on that east facing side of that, and so you have a drainage that's facing west on the opposite side, that's a really good setup.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard for me to, it's hard to explain right here, but
yeah, no, I can picture that, and I know you have a lot of videos on your YouTube channel too that walk through a lot of examples too, and sometimes it is definitely easier to actually see on the map, but I can picture it in my head, and hopefully people listening can too. But if not, I encourage them to go to your YouTube channel because
there's definitely some things on there. You just got to think about a north south running ridge with a west facing thermal hub or drainage or something. A couple of them facing the west, and those east facing ridge sides are going to be the ones that are going to get that sun first. And if you're in that pre-rut time period, that's a really good place to be. That's kind of the things that I'm trying to identify right now, or that kind of,
that sign that's getting popped up now and set up for later.
Yep.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I think because I think a lot of times, and this is probably a false perception, but I think sometimes hunters just only look at thermals in relation to how it impacts their hunt versus how the deer are using the thermals, and you're looking at it from a different perspective where why are the deer doing what they're doing, and how are they using the thermals?
Yeah. I think we look at it as, and that's kind of the way. Like I had a friend that hunts, and I grew up with him hunting, and he was that way. Like I think I learned a lot of this from him, but in the back of my mind, I didn't really put it together when I was in my 20s. But he would hunt off the thermals a lot. Like he was the one that taught me about the swirling winds and the drainages and things like that, and how the deer would use them. And I don't even know if he was really he really understood what he was hunting, but he knew what he was doing enough that I caught enough information off of it. And then my dad was a fireman. Like he worked for the Forest Service, so I used to always study like the fire books and stuff like that. Like he was heavily into wildfire prevention and wildfire. So a lot of this thermal stuff, a lot of this wind stuff is stuff that I've learned from him and going through his fire schools and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I learned a lot of it doing that, and I just, it's kind of like putting all that information to use. But yeah, I think a lot of people they don't consider exactly what the thermals are doing, especially for a mature buck. I don't think does and younger bucks, I don't think they put a lot of stock into it, other than I think does use it for entering feeding areas,
Sure.
but I don't think as far as their movement that they really consider the the thermals. But I think
Mhm.
a mature buck is pretty much living off of them in a lot of ways,
Yeah.
especially in
Well,
areas you don't have a consistent wind.
yeah, and that's I assume the main case where you're at. But you brought up a really cool point with the fire side of things. Anytime I do a prescribed burn, I'm always paying close attention to see what is that fire doing, where's the smoke going, and how is it
Yeah,
interacting. And I think that's a really good illustration, especially in the timber setting too, where you see, wow, it burnt really fast, really hot up this hill, and it
yeah,
smoldered in another spot.
yeah, yeah. And that's what my like I said, my dad spent a lot of time doing that, and I tagged along a lot doing that. So we learned, studying exactly why fire didn't burn in this on this and this drainage as hot as it did on this. Like it was just, and a lot of times it didn't make sense to me back then.
Hmm.
But now doing it, and looking back at it, and re-familiarizing myself with it, it 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 has a lot to do with with, because they also studied how would animals react to this. That was one of their things too, especially when he was doing the fires out west, is how would you know how would it affect the resources that are out on the landscape. So um, they had plans in place for things like that. So
Hmm.
it's just a really cool thing that I learned when I was a lot younger that I didn't realize I would ever be applying to my hunting nowadays.
Yeah, you definitely that's a really cool perspective after you learn it kind of as a kid and then you put it into your hunting strategy. Like, oh, this everything starts to click a little bit easier than someone learned from scratch. Yeah. So it's October 2nd right now, and this is a question for people that are hunting in the month of October and the month of November. And we'll just kind of conclude this to the eastern Midwest type of deer hunting, and maybe even southern where you're at in Alabama. But how much do you think thermals change from full foliage in October versus when the canopy is basically open in mid to late November?
It's going to change a good bit. Yeah. It's just going to change as far as the timing. Um, Once you have the leaf off conditions, the upper elevations are going to warm up quicker, and that warm up period um, is going to be quicker for the lower elevations, like the drainages and the thermal hubs and things like that you're basically hunting off of. So you know, right now, once that sun gets behind at a certain position in the sun, those east facing drainages and thermals and ridge facing things like that are dropping thermals a lot quicker. I noticed that this weekend. I noticed um, a lot of, believe it or not, we've had a drought here. So this is one thing that I think I hadn't really put a lot of thought into, but we don't have a lot of soil moisture right now.
Hmm.
So one thing I noticed this weekend is the rising thermals kicked in a lot earlier on the east facing and north facing slopes. So that's another condition that you have to really pay attention to when you're working with these thermals, is the condition of your soil. If
Hmm.
you have really damp soil conditions, it's going to take a lot longer to heat that soil up. So conversely, the opposite. Right now, we have really really low soil condition right now as far as moisture in the ground. So it's rising a lot quicker in the mornings.
Hmm.
So in areas where there's a couple areas that I walked into, that I thought I would have a dropping thermal, and because it's so dry, once that sun didn't even have to have the sun. It was just simply the air temperature had changed that thermal so much. So
Interesting.
there's a lot of conditions that really go into it, but that's one thing that I noticed right now is soil condition has a lot to do with it. But definitely, as you lose that foliage, um, then the areas you're wanting to look at are going to be the lower elevations. That's why I think in that initial leaf drop down here in the south, at least, we see once that initial leaf drop hits, because it tends to be your higher elevations that lose those leaves earlier, and then it kind of creeps down into the lower elevations. Those lower elevation bedding areas tend to light up until there's a complete leaf drop, and then it kind of switches over to finding that thicker cover at that point in time.
That's interesting. I've never considered that. So basically, reiterate, as the higher elevation trees lose their foliage, the bottoms get a lot more sign and a lot more activity. So
Yeah,
how do you implement hunting bottoms with thermals in mind? Because that's
so it's tricky, man.
yeah.
Yeah, and and I try to hunt the bottoms a little bit. I'm usually trying to find myself on a creek or something like that that's really going to have a high thermal draw.
Hmm.
Because a lot of times your creeks, if they're running enough water, um, they'll pull that thermal all day. It doesn't matter, it could be 90 degrees outside, and they're still going to be pulling that thermal. So if I'm trying to hunt a bottom, it's got to have, in that early season, it's got to have strong water flow. I don't like getting down there in the bottom at all. There's a ton of sign down in there, but I'm trying to just hunt. I'm trying to hunt. If I'm trying to hunt off of the bottom, I'm trying to hunt up in elevation where I got at least enough wind flow to get my scent into an area that maybe I walk through, like on my excess or something like that.
Hmm.
Like, I'm just trying not to blow out. You're in these elevation, in these ridges and valleys and stuff like that, you can't help but blowing deer out, because they're a lot of times, what I've seen is they're just moving in random areas now. It's not like a dedicated path of movement, so it's kind of give and take. You may have to give up a drainage to hunt another drainage. You may just have to blow it out in order to obtain your objective that you're trying to do. But sometimes it's worth it.
Hmm.
But yeah, like last year, I really noticed this. That's what I was saying about is I noticed a lot of bucks that were bedding down in these bottoms in that early, and I was like, I wonder why that is. And so I started going back and looking at like my trail camera data from the year before, and it seemed like until those bottoms got completely leaf dropped, like they were equal to the upper elevations, that they were holding those bucks longer. So that's
Hmm.
something that.
Do you think it's their wind advantage is even more at that point in those bottoms
Oh yeah,
when it's cooler?
yeah,
So that's part of the reason
yeah.
why they're down in there.
Yeah, definitely. Because you got to think, if those upper ridges are without any foliage, and they're down there where it's cooler, well, all of that scent that's along those ridges is going to be pulled. Because you see that a lot. Like those low elevations would maintain those because they're cooler. They got the leaf. They're still holding on to a lot. 80% of their leaves.
Hmm.
So they're almost acting like a waterway. You know,
Yeah.
like they're pulling all that thermal down into them. So that's why they were staying in those bottoms. It had a lot to do with that. It had a lot to do. We were going through a drought, but I started looking at it from the years before, and it was still the same thing. So
Hmm.
I think the drought that we had last year at this same time of year probably pushed them a little more down. But I think probably that, along with the lack of mast up on those ridges too, and that's something we're not seeing this year. We are seeing the drought already starting to kick in, but we have such a massive amount of hard mass right now that it's just changed things. So, um, you know, what I'm thinking, um, is more of a generalization rather than it can change year to year based on food source. I think a lot too,
Yeah.
but
That,
but definitely I think even right now, like I've talked to a few friends, and they're not seeing they're not seeing sign up on the ridge points, even though we have a heavy mast. Everything is down low. So I think it's just one of those things that's happening right now, because the drought here is affecting the upper ridges a lot more, where you don't have up that much moisture, so they're dropping their leaves a lot quicker.
yeah. As far as using a creek or a water, some sort of water source for manipulating your thermals, well, is there any rules of thumb? Because there's probably someone thinking out there, they have let's say a creek, a rock bottom creek that sometimes has water, or maybe there's some pockets and it's not really flowing.
Yeah,
Is that something you still think you can take advantage of, or do you want to see you throw a stick and watch it pull down the creek?
yeah. I mean, even like if you have a high enough bank creek, like that's the thing that I see a lot of is ditches and creeks and stuff like that. It may not have water flowing in it, but if it's a rocky bottom or sandy bottom creek, that doesn't have water flowing in it, if it has deep enough like sides to it, a lot of times those will even pull, um,
Mm.
they'll even pull thermals without water flow. Water flow definitely makes a big difference, but even without that, if you have a ditch of any kind or a creek bank that's say, head high or something like that, you're going to have thermals in that because it's just not going to get as much airflow. Warm air is not going to pile off into it to heat the ground up. So a lot of times those are pulling of course, to the lowest elevation, even if there's not much water flow in them.
Hmm.
So that,
Yeah.
yeah, definitely. I have one that I almost killed a buck off of last year. That's what I was using, was a ditch. Basically thinking he's going to be working that ditch that he had some scrapes on,
Hmm.
and I didn't. I ended up. I took a shot at him. I put him down, but I never found him.
Oh man.
And that ditch, he was doing exactly that. He was using that ditch. That was he was actually working against the wind, but he was using that ditch as a form of travel, getting those thermals off of it.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. And if that's where the thermals are already pulling, then they have an easy path to cover a lot of ground,
Yeah,
get a lot of scent, and try to find the
yeah,
next doe.
yeah, yeah. He was using that ditch because that ditch, um, and that's the same thing with creeks and stuff like that. A lot of people don't want. I think we think like the same thing. I had a buck a couple of years ago using a creek to travel around in, and I thought, well, man, he's using that creek as his as his like hideout, like way to travel without being seen or leaving a track or anything like that. But I thought, well, that makes sense, but that's not the total story. And I think he was using that creek because at that time we had a lot of days that were kind of cloudy during this period of time when he was using that creek a lot. And I think it was because that creek was pulling so much thermal information from above, from the higher elevations, because a bunch of ridges connected to it, a bunch of drainages did. So I think he was using that creek, that channel of that creek that I was catching him on a lot, as just an information dump. Like, I can walk this creek and I don't have to, work up into these ridges and expose myself. I can just walk this creek and get all the scent information that's anywhere around them.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so I watched one of your videos, and it was a situation where the thermals weren't doing what they're quote unquote supposed to do, and
Yeah.
the theme there was you don't rely on rising thermals to masking your scent.
Yeah.
Can you just explain that to me like I'm a really young kid or like someone that doesn't know anything? I just want to understand it, crystal clear.
Yeah, that's something that yeah, I don't rely on the rising thermals because it can, in like that video, there was no reason for me to have a dropping thermal there. Absolutely
Hmm.
no. I'm basically saying, the area I was kind of sitting in was kind of shady, but everything around me was lit up, and it was 1 o'clock in the day. Like 1 o'clock in the middle of the day. It was 95 degrees, so the ground was sufficiently warm. There was no reason, but the issue was that you know less than 100 yards away from me was a drainage that was full of hemlock and had a creek running through it. So it had so much cool air pooling in that area and being pulled down that it pulled the associated winds that were on that little buffer area down with it. So my warm air was being pulled down by that much cooler. Like, it was 15 degrees cooler in that bottom. So that had so much of a draw that if I'd have set up there thinking, well, I got rising thermals here, I'll be covered if a deer comes below me. I'll be on that edge where all of my scent would come up, would rise above me or rise up the ridge. And so when he's running that buffer below me, I'll be safe. But
Hmm.
with the rising thermals as much. And another thing is, like I said earlier, we think that the rising thermals are going up through the canopy and into infinity, when usually your landscape, if you're here, unless you're dealing with a consistent like habitat, like tree type, like pines, or you got 1,000 acres of hardwood, At some point in time, that thermal, that current is going to hit a pocket of cool air. There's going to be something that's pulling it back down to the ground. So
Mm-hmm.
if you're hunting above a drainage or something like that that's pulling a lot of downward thermals, and you're hunting on that edge, and you're thinking that buck is coming up to that drainage, and you're thinking you're safe. I mean, it could be. I mean, you could be safe, but I would rather utilize a little more wind current at that point in time. Um, you know, because I don't know that my scent is not going up above the canopy where I can't see my milkweed anymore, and then dropping out back into that falling thermal.
Mm-hmm.
Because what happens is when you get those falling thermals pulling and those rising thermals going up, you get a turbine effect right there because you got opposite wind flows, and it doesn't take much to do that. Thermal is not like a strong wind current, but when you get those 2 points that are meeting, you get the heating and cooling of the air in the same area, and it just it just basically causes a rolling effect. So that's why I don't try to set up in those are like really tricky areas to set up on. They're really good to set up on because that's the deer are using the same information, especially those mature bucks. That's a good area to get a lot of information. So that's why they run those areas. But it's just really, really tricky. I would rather just hunt based off of a kind of a consistent wind direction in the mornings rather than trying to hunt off a rising thermal. And the only thermal I really, like try to hunt off of consistently is those falling thermals in the afternoon because I know they're going to be consistent enough no matter what is happening, unless you have rain or something like that, or you just have stagnant air. If you have just regular days that you don't have a lot of stagnant air and you don't have a lot of really strong wind, you can hunt those falling thermals pretty consistently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you want to try unplugging or plugging your mic back in? I don't know if something happened there. I can hear you, but there's a popping now.
For some reason, I can't hear you.
I'll type in here. Try.
Hold on just a second.
Oh, I think I might have you now.
Oh, yeah, there we go.
There we are. Perfect. Yeah. I don't know what happened there, but yeah, it's good there. I'll write down the time so we can edit that out. 42. The wind turbine effect that you're talking about, I don't know how many times I've been in that without knowing what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And I'm dropping the thermal and I'm like, how is this coming right back to me? 5 minutes later, 3 minutes later.
Yeah. I did that. I realized that like last year. I was in this one area and there's a lot of it was just a spine ridge and it dropped off to a really deep drainage to the left, and there was a ton of sign on it. I'm like, and it didn't look spectacular. Like as far as habitat, it was just this open hardwood, like it looked really pretty woods, but there was just scrapes, rubs, beds, everything like sitting in this area. I'm like, this doesn't make sense. It looks almost too pretty to have all this sign in it. So I started dropping milkweed in it, and this was just with like, I think I had a southwest wind. It was like 4 or 5 mile an hour. Wasn't anything spectacular. And I would drop milkweed in one spot, and it would go down, and it would go down like 15 feet, and then it would come back above me, and it would come back and pass me. It was just the oddest thing. I'm like, well, this makes sense. I mean, he can sit right here, and there's no telling what all like he can put all of his scent right here, and there's no telling where this information is going to.
Yeah.
It's just crazy. So yeah, you can get in those areas and it and like I said, they're really good areas to hunt. But man, it's like you're on a knife blade.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And I like how you keep referring thermals as information because that's I think such a key indication. And I mentioned that previously, but you're right. Yeah, that is so much information for a buck trying to figure out what the heck's going on and who's in the area.
Yeah, I mean, because you got to think about. I mean, a buck's sense of hearing is, he can hear what's around him, like within a general area. He can see what's in front of him, or what's within his area. But the information he's getting from his nose can be from everything he can't see and can't hear.
Yeah.
Because it's just that powerful of a scent indicator. So, he may be going through the woods using his vision and his sense of sound to keep him protected, but he's using his nose to get all the information off of that terrain.
Yeah. Yeah, that's huge. So you mentioned you're a bit of a trail camera junkie. So I have to ask, roughly how many cameras do you have deployed in a typical year?
Oh my goodness, it's went. I started out with like right at 100.
Mhm.
Well, I started out with just a handful, of course, and then
Sure.
got into helping some guys do a little. They wanted to do a little. They were doing. I don't know. It's like a 10-year study that they're doing, and they just wanted to have some video of scrape interactions and stuff like that. So help them guys out. They gave me a bunch of cameras, and that kind of set the fire, And now I have close to 300, I think, right now.
Oh my
Uh,
gosh.
I've still got about. I don't have 300 out right now. I've pulled
Mhm.
a bunch. So right now I'm sitting at like right at 170, maybe a little more, that are out right now. Um, and I probably have another 80 that I'm waiting to put out, that I've
What
got
do
to
you
pull and put out.
what are you waiting for? When do you plan on deploying those?
I want to deploy most of those once I start seeing a lot of rut sign, like
Okay.
heavy rut sign. That way I can pick out those really primary scrapes, those hot scrapes that are being used, and I can back away from those and figure out, kind of the information that I had. And I'm talking about specifically the new area that I'm working on. That's what I'm trying to do right now is just wait till I see that really heavy rut sign that'll probably be kicking off here in the next couple of weeks, and I'm just going to pound those areas with cameras, and
Mhm.
I'll probably be in areas that I may not even worry about hunting in.
Just to get that information for next
Just
year.
to get that information for next year.
Yeah.
Yep,
Yeah.
yep. Because
That's
I'm
really
usually one of those people that picks out, like, I don't kill a bunch of deer.
Mhm.
I kill, it may take me 3 years to kill the deer I want. Like I've just gotten to that point. I've killed a lot of deer in my life when I was younger, so it's not about killing a number of deer. It's about killing the deer I want.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's a pretty common evolution for deer hunters, and that amount of cameras. Do you ever find running that amount of cameras confusing, or is it just? I mean, I run, let's say 50, and
Yeah,
I sometimes have a hard time keeping track of everything and not hunting but keeping myself from hunting cameras and hunting deer.
yeah,
And
yeah.
so,
I
what do you say to that?
I did the same thing. Yeah, like I didn't so much last year, but year before last, I basically wasted my whole year like just chasing cameras. It was just and I didn't really. I got close to a deer really early on, like one that I wanted, and when I didn't seal the deal on that, I almost just I wouldn't say gave up, but it took a little bit of a fire out from under me, and so I just started chasing cameras. Basically, I said, well, if something clicks, I'll put it together. But if not, I'm just going to try to get as much information for next year.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's and now, like I lose track of how many I've got, out. Like in my mind, I have to go back and look at my phone and start, but as far as tracking them, I'm really good because, and I don't know how I'll be here because it's a whole different ball game. Like I'm not as familiar with that, but I was intimately familiar with the area that I had them on before. Like I grew up in that area, I knew every inch of the woods, so it wasn't hard for me to keep in my mind a track of where they were. Now, when I moved them off onto a big piece of private and started doing kind of a separate study on unpressured deer, that I'm just letting those soak. So there's like 70 in that area that are just soaking, and
Oh wow.
they won't be pulled until probably next summer. Is when I plan on going in there and pulling them. I'm going in there and checking the cards periodically, but not very often,
Hmm.
and to change batteries and stuff like that. But I'm not going to pull them until next summer. So there's 75 sitting on a piece of property that's not going to get hunted.
That'll
Uh,
be fascinating
yeah,
to see what you learn and comparing
yeah,
it to the public. That'll be really
yeah.
cool to
So
know.
that's what I'm planning on doing, is seeing exactly if there's how much difference. And I can tell you right now, just based off of what I've seen since I put them out in I put those out in March, so during turkey season. It's a dramatic difference. That private area that doesn't get hunted versus the public that does, and the deer density is identical. So it's not like it's like loaded with deer.
Sure. Yeah.
It just doesn't get pressure at all, like none. And the deer are acting completely different there.
Just
Yeah,
just
just
drastically
off the
more daylight
summer. Yeah,
movement, and yeah,
yeah,
yeah, that'd
yeah,
be really cool to see how the behaviors during the rut too. If
yeah,
it's a much more intense, or how much, if it's a 3-to-1 ratio of daylight activity for bucks, that would be
yeah,
really fascinating.
yeah, yeah. But yeah, so yeah, as far as just keeping track of them, I try to, of course, I pin every one of them. I try to put them in folders on different. Like at one time, I had, like 2 Onyx accounts because I had so many going. Now I've kind of pared it down, so it's a lot simpler, and it's just putting in folders that you can keep track of, and then not losing track of those folders, like not forgetting about them. That's what I do right now. Is, gosh, I had some last year, and I'm like, gosh, I put these 30 out. I completely forgot about them. Like I went the whole year and the whole season and never checked any of them. And it wasn't until turkey season I was actually walking in there. I was like, oh, there's one of my cameras. Oh yeah, I put these in here. Like I completely just
That's a
forgot
that's
about them during.
it's like when you find $20 in your pocket when you put on
Oh
your winter
yeah,
coat.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I was like, oh, I got all this stuff now. It took me like 2 weeks to kind of go through all that to get all that data that was off those cards and make sense of it.
Yeah.
But yeah,
You released a video that I found really interesting. It was about basically October 2022 mature buck daylight movements in the month of October,
yeah,
and you broke down the different peak days, and it was pretty cool to see the very distinct spikes and activity.
yeah,
And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed like some of those for the first half of October, it looked like most of the activity was right before the front and not right after the front. Did I look at that chart right?
yeah. That day, the day of the front passing, like, yeah, that's a big spike day.
Mhm.
Just because you're usually getting that really strong wind shift, that comes in before those fronts, and that for some reason down here, and I don't know if it would be the same anywhere else, but we get like the day of like we got a northwest frontal passage, which that's the way they usually come in from the northwest. We get a lot of really strong like south, like here we're supposed to have east southeast all week,
Yep.
east northeast, east southeast, and then the day of it's supposed to switch out of southwest just before that front. And that's just the wind. As that front comes along, it pushes that wind. This is what I've learned meteorologically,
Uh-huh.
is that it just sucks that wind up in front of it from out of the southwest. That's when we're getting those winds. But that really kicked off a lot of movement. Was that pre frontal passage
Hmm.
of the winds, and then it wasn't. The movement was really intense for those couple days after the frontal movement, and it died off really quick because it's usually a switching back of the wind.
Hmm.
Once you get into November, what I've noticed is that tends to last a little longer. That intense period of movement, because those frontal passages seem to maintain that northerly wind flow for a little longer, and it keeps things a little cooler for a little bit longer of a period. But man, those early season cold fronts are just money.
Yeah. And we have one coming up here this week,
Yeah,
and so this is
yeah,
going to go live tomorrow. But let's talk about your strategy for this cold front, because I'm sure a lot of guys are going to listen to this, and maybe they'll get some insight on how they should proceed with this next cold front. The first cold front of October is something we've been waiting for a really long
yeah,
time. So, what's
yeah.
your strategy? What are some advice, and what are some of the setups you'll be spending time in?
Well, right now, I mean, man, I'm looking at that Friday. Like I'm definitely planning on being in the woods that Friday afternoon, because I think that it's supposed to pass here,
Hmm.
like Friday at like 2 o'clock. So I'm really planning on that Friday being in the woods, and with the amount of sign that I'm seeing right now, this early rut sign that I didn't really particularly intend on being. I think scrapes are going to go bananas.
Yeah.
That's usually what I saw last year and the year before. Is that first cold front just got them up on their feet, and got them to making. And once we get the younger bucks, this is what I was talking to another couple of guys up here hunting. Once you can get those younger bucks to creating, they've dropped their velvet, and once they start making scrapes, it's like that kicks in for those older deer. I got a little competition now, and this cold front has got me feeling good.
Yeah.
It's taking some pressure off of me. I'm not dealing with the heat, man. I'm going to lay down some sign. And that's not what they're thinking, but physiologically,
That's what they're
that's
doing.
where they should be.
Yeah.
Like, so I'm looking for those areas this weekend that are going to light up with those scrapes. And I may not be even looking at where scrapes have already been put, but I'm looking at areas like similar to that will start popping up.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a lot of historical, like things in the back of my mind that I'm putting in those thermal hubs that are kind of tucked away, hidden somewhere. Uh, sitting using those in the afternoons to hunt off of. Man, that's I'm excited for it. I really am, because
Yeah.
it's been money the last few years.
And so, just so I assume it's the same front that I'm in Illinois here, and it's like what you're talking about: east, south, southeast wind, south wind, and
Yeah,
then we have the day before the front, which would be Thursday. It's going southwest, and then it's going
yeah.
to go west northwest. So would you try to hunt that Thursday when it's still southwest, like right
Oh
before
yeah,
that front hits?
yeah.
Okay.
Oh gosh, yeah, definitely. Because I mean that's going to be that, and they probably are not going to be moving. Um, the those southwest winds for some reason. Uh, I don't know if it's because of the strength of the wind, because it usually those southwest winds usually are a little bit stronger,
Hmm.
and it seems like the stronger winds just get them moving like longer distances,
Hmm.
for some reason. So yeah, I'm definitely gonna hunt that the day before that thing comes in. Like I said, ours is coming in, I think, here like Friday evening.
Hmm.
So all day Friday should just be, bang up, because you're going to get that strong southwest wind. We're not going to get much moisture here, but yeah, you want to take advantage of that 24 hours before that front passes, because that's usually when you have a really strong wind. It's usually a really, really quick switch wind, like
Hmm.
it flips on a dime, and that'll just get them going.
Well, that's exciting. It's going to be here in just a couple days, a couple more sleeps, and
Yeah,
it's game
yeah,
on. And so you
yeah,
mentioned you're trying to hunt on scrapes that maybe aren't there from this last weekend, but maybe where they historically have popped up as
yeah,
those cold fronts rolled in October.
yeah. Yeah, that's exactly it. Like now, I think a few of the scrapes that were I located from last year. I'm just gonna. I got a couple days this week. Like I got tomorrow afternoon and Wednesday morning. I'm gonna try to get out there and put some more cameras out, find a couple more of those spots. I've located a couple of bucks that I'm really interested in hunting up here already. So I'm gonna just be hammering those spots that I think they're gonna be, popping up this weekend, and
Mhm.
that's probably where I'm gonna be hanging, and hopefully at least seeing something this weekend. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's definitely, if you have areas that, to me, what I've seen on my trail camera, and just anecdotally, like I don't really realize this until I go back and look at my camera data, and it kind of reiterates what I've kind of seen, is if you have areas that, and the buck made, you have a buck, identified, and you have good historical data on him, hunt those areas that those scrapes popped up this time last year, because he's going to be right back there. They're a creature of habit, and unless something's happened to him, that's where I'm going to bank on. So if you have good historical data on the buck you're after, right now is the time to get on those scrapes. And I'm not a big scrape hunter, but when it comes this time of year and you get those initial cold fronts, that's what they're laying down, and that's something you can definitely bank on.
Oh man. Well, I know my you refined my strategy because I'm itching to hunt this front because it should be really good, and it's
Yeah,
obviously the,
yeah,
the the beautiful part of this season too is hypothetically it only gets better for quite some time in theory
yeah,
based off of daylight activity for
yeah.
bucks. So that's really
Oh yeah,
exciting.
yeah. Right now you're getting, like, from what I've seen, just trail camera data, you're at like 30%
Hmm.
of what it could be, right now. So yeah, we got a long ways to go.
Yeah, definitely. Well, is there any other parting piece of advice that we didn't necessarily cover that I should have asked you, or any other things that really pop out for the month of October?
Not that I can really think of. I mean, I think we've covered a really good gamut right now. So I can't really think of anything that's really just really clicking for me right now.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to get you back on. I want to talk about what your findings are for the private versus public, and also
Yeah,
just there's there's not a lot of people that are running 300 cameras too. So you inherently just learn a lot more than what
yeah,
the average guy does just from
yeah,
the pure data points. So
yeah, yeah. And along with that, like I study a lot of the GPS college studies from Penn State, from Auburn,
mhm.
and schools like that. So I put a lot of that information in with what I see on my cameras, and man, it when you could put those two together, man, I'd love for them to do a study with something like that and utilize trail cameras with it
Yeah,
and just see exactly what's
what
going on in those 30 minutes that they're not pinging.
yeah, yeah, for sure. And even on those, just to get an idea of the demeanor of the buck too throughout
Yeah,
the year, and it
yeah,
see.
oh yeah.
Yeah, I think that that'll probably be the next phase. But
Yeah, it's
those are
the
exciting.
trail camera thing. That's something I will say a lot of is I get to see a lot of the personality of bucks, with all these trail cameras and
Mhm.
how they interact and how they're so different. So that's one of the cool things that the GPS study really doesn't give you. It gives you where the buck was, but you can't get the persona of the buck
Yeah.
unless you're like watching him, watching him interact with the things in his surroundings. So
Yeah, it would also be interesting to see with historical data. So let's say they ran a GPS study on a deer for 1 year, and then
yeah,
introduce cameras and see if it changes his behavior at all, and if he
yeah,
does indeed try to avoid cameras, or if he changes his behavior in any fashion. I think
yeah.
that'd be
That'd
fascinating
be
to know too.
fascinating. Yeah, that
Yeah.
really would. Yeah, yeah.
But no, well, Shane, I really appreciate your time here, and I'm excited to follow along on your season, and I look forward to talking again here soon. But where can people find your YouTube channel? Because if you want to learn stuff about thermals, then I encourage them to go to your channel for sure.
Yeah, you can look up November Warrior Outdoors on YouTube. I've also got same thing for Facebook and for Instagram. Usually everything is linked on there. You can look me up on Facebook under Shane Parker, um, and send me a friend request or follow me on there. And usually when I'm posting stuff, like I said, with all this move, I really haven't done anything lately, but I've got 3 or 4 in the waiting in the that are loaded up and ready to go, that I'll be posted here over the next couple of weeks to kind of update, get things moving a little more. So, but I
Awesome.
appreciate you having me on.
No,
It's been great talking with you.
yeah, thoroughly enjoyed it. So, yeah, I encourage people to go check out what you have going on, and like I said, good luck this season, and we'll have to talk again here soon.
Good luck to you too. Good luck to everybody out there.